transformed the governing of the church and the exercise of discipline. It's not a well-known fact, but outside of England and Lutheran Germany, the Protestant world in the 1500s and 1600s was almost entirely Presbyterian. Every clearly reformed church practiced a Presbyterian polity or method of church governance, and assembly debates about the shepherding of the flock were punctuated with references to the practices of foreign churches, chiefly those of the Netherlands, Scotland, Geneva, and France. The Reformed Church in France was a special source of inspiration for worldwide 17th century Presbyterianism. It was Presbyterian in principle. The church showed its visible unity through a connectional church government and by expressing a common faith agreed in their confessions. It was also Presbyterian in structures. Local elderships were subject to regional elderships, and there were courts of the church that were set up to hear appeals in cases where injustice was done to church members. For those who participated in the life of the church, it was pretty obvious that the church was Presbyterian in practice. On a congregational level, elders and not members were called to lead local churches, and elections to local elderships were, in those days, in some cases, reviewed by the presbyteries. For example, in cases where multiple members of one family were also members of one consistory. There the church was concerned that a biblical polity could get replaced by a local oligarchy. Elders and deacons were normally to be chosen by the church's, by the congregation's eldership, with the congregation offering consent. This was typical of the 1600s and 1700s. Foreign observers found the French Reformed Church interesting because of the rigor of its discipline and the depth of its doctrinal debates, and yet most impressive to a watching and worrying and praying Protestant world was the commitment to a church, Reformed church order in the face of eventual intense persecution in France. Who could fail to be moved by a 17th century French synod at which the pastors and elders did all unanimously protest to live and die by their confession, if God called them to it? Well, national churches such as the Reformed Church of France provided models for other Reformation and post-Reformation Presbyterian movements. A Presbyterian movement was developed in the Caribbean. A very clever colleague of mine in England got a grant from the government to study Presbyterianism in the Caribbean in the winter. I mean, why not? Presbyterianism also made its way east with the support of local and regional civil governments. It was practiced in Hungary, for example, and elsewhere in Central Europe. Well, in England, the ecclesiological or churchly landscape was more complicated than on the continent. In the late 16th century, we heard the other day that there were different Presbyterian theorists who tried to change the government of the Church of England, but in practice, Presbyterians were driven underground because the authorities were opposed to Presbyterianism. Indeed, the experience of 16th and 17th century Presbyterianism in England has some parallels to how Presbyterianism is treated in China today, with the government especially concerned about Presbyterianism more than any other form of Christianity. Presbyterianism, in the first place, had the potential, and in China has the potential, to create a real national network, unlike Congregationalism with its independent churches. Second, Presbyterianism could not be controlled from the top by the government, unlike Episcopalianism or Roman Catholicism, where you can control the archbishops, you can control the bishops and the archdeacons and the priests and so on. And third, Presbyterianism insists on the government of the church that is distinct from the government of the state. Well, in spite of that underground movement of Presbyterianism, a movement that became harder and harder to spot during James's reign and the first part of Charles' reign, in spite of the knowledge there was some underground Presbyterianism, very few pastors who came to the Westminster Assembly were clearly sort of card-carrying Presbyterians from day one. A small number of those who showed up at the Westminster Assembly were actually Episcopalians. They thought that the church should be run by bishops. A small number of those who showed up and stayed, Episcopalians did not stay, were Congregationalists. They thought the church should be run by local elderships or even local congregations. Some of those who showed up were Presbyterian in principle, but had never practiced it or seen it practiced. Some were just undecided about church government. They were recovering from Episcopal abuse, but they weren't sure Presbyterianism was the answer. Among these were people who thought that Presbyterianism sounded wise and practical, but weren't yet sure if it was biblical. One of these, an old minister named Thomas Bailey, told in the Westminster Assembly a story about how recently a woman in his church, after a service, in fact only months before, had rebuked him, telling him basically to get with the program. You know, how can he be still a supporter of episcopacy or not sure what he believed when all of the other Reformed churches were already Presbyterian? So, rebuked by this woman in his congregation, he went back and studied his Bible, and he was one of those who came to the Westminster Assembly a committed Presbyterian. Well, I'm guessing that all of us here fit into some camp. Closet Episcopalians who snuck their way into a Bible Presbyterian conference, maybe some Congregationalists of Baptist flavor, and maybe some of you are Presbyterians, and maybe some of you are Presbyterians who don't quite know why you are. And so by listening to the Westminster Assembly's debates over these subjects, perhaps all of us will leave tonight more clear in our own minds about certainly what the Westminster Assembly thought, and perhaps what the Bible itself teaches. The first matter of church government, of shepherding the church that the Assembly debated in 1643 was, of course, England's episcopal heritage. All of these men were born in Episcopalian churches, except for the Scots. And so the Assembly grasped this thorny topic first with both hands, wondering about how many offices should be in the church, whether shepherding bishops should be replaced by ruling elders or by ministers who do the work of shepherding and ruling. This effort was in itself momentous. No Reformed church had ever gone from being Episcopalian to Presbyterian after the Reformation era. Of course, I just explained why. They were all Presbyterian to begin with. But nonetheless, this was very difficult to conceptualize, to think through for members who had always been Episcopalian. Some Presbyterian members of the Assembly thought that the discussion about ruling elders might be off limit because they already said that they would obey the bishops. What did they do about the fact that they had, at their ordination, said they'd obey the bishops? Could they really discuss this issue with a free conscience? Others were convinced that every congregation should have ruling elders who would shepherd alongside the minister. Others thought, no, we need to get rid of the bishops. But once we've got rid of the bishops, we just need pastors to do discipline. We don't need this thing called ruling elders. Some said, yes, a ruling elder is biblical, but it's not clear that every church needs to have one of those. Why can't some churches have ruling elders and other churches not? The arguments for 4 bishops raised in the assembly were the usual ones. The church has had bishops for a really long time. There are traditional reasons to have bishops, and early church preachers and pastors, theologians and exegetes believed in episcopacy. And Chrysostom, the greatest preacher of the early church, he talks about bishops and is in favor of them. Augustine, the greatest theologian, he was in favor of bishops. Jerome is the greatest exegete, he's in favor of bishops. Presbyterians responded by saying these arguments from tradition cut 2 different ways. Yes, those 3 great men, among others, believed in episcopacy, but all of them said the Bible didn't teach it. They just said it was convenient that the church did it. The argument isn't quite as helpful as Episcopalians might like. Furthermore, the fact that something was always done was not a sufficient justification, and in recent years, bishops have been ruthless, fining people, jailing people, exiling people, maiming people who spoke against the bishops, cutting off ears, noses, cutting out tongues from people who would disagree with them. It didn't seem like tradition was going to be a sufficient argument. Episcopalians also argued that in the Old Testament we see hierarchies. The judges under Moses, priests under Aaron. The Presbyterians responded and explained that this refers to a judicial system and a sacrificial system that are both done away with at the time of Christ. A better analogy would be that of Old Testament elders who don't seem to have been arranged in the hierarchical way. Episcopalians would try to argue from letters to Timothy and Titus that Paul had bishops working under him. The Presbyterians responded to these Episcopalians and said, well, if Titus was acting like a bishop, say, in the way in which he was planting churches in Crete, he was clearly a bishop trying to work himself out of a job. Because what was he doing? He was appointing multiple elders, or as the Apostle Paul calls them, bishops, in every church. Multiple bishops in every congregation doesn't look very Episcopalian. What's more, it's impossible to argue from Scripture that overseers, bishops, or elders are 2 different kinds of things, because the Bible uses the words interchangeably, such as it does in Titus chapter 1, verses 5 to 9. In the end, the Episcopalians lost the debate. The rule of bishops was gone. Well, overlapping with the debates about bishops, the assembly began to discuss the rights of congregations. Prior to the Westminster Assembly, congregations didn't have any rights. A patron, usually a wealthy businessman, maybe part of the local gentry, maybe a lord, a peer, a duke, a king, maybe a bishop, would just tell people who the minister was going to be. And that was that. Well, the Westminster Assembly had both Presbyterians and Congregationalists who knew that was wrong. They believed that the members of the congregation had to have some say in choosing who was brought to them. And one way of kind of figuring that out, although it's not very easy, is to think through the qualifications for elders and deacons. How when Titus went from town to town, would he know what people's characters were like? How would he know who was gifted to teach? Well, he would only know that by getting input from the people. And so the Westminster Assembly argued that there has to be congregational involvement in the calling of the minister. Now, many of them felt it was enough for a presbyterian to say, how about this guy? No search committees, just how about Bob? And people could say yes to Bob or no to Bob. But the idea was the congregation would actually get veto power or even a choice. They could even perhaps look for someone themselves. Well, the Congregationalists at the assembly were very happy with this development, but they wanted more. They believed that each congregation ought to be able to do all of its own work without any interference from outside. They believed that a congregation ought to be able to choose its own minister and to do its own discipline, and that there should never be the involvement of or an appeal to a presbyterian. The Congregationalists believed in a principle best summarizes the sufficiency of the local church. Each church that Christ has on earth, each local congregation, which is what they mean by church, is entirely sufficient to itself. Christ has given it all that it will ever need. After all, did not Christ say that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church? Didn't he say that as Christ ascended into heaven, he gave gifts to his church? The local church has everything it needs. The principle of the sufficiency of the local church was not satisfactory to Presbyterians. First, they had a different foundational principle. They said much clearer than a principle of the sufficiency of the local church is the idea of the visible unity of the church. That is a concept much clearer in the Bible. The visible unity of the body of Christ. Each church should do its best to express visibly its unity with other churches. It can do so, of course, with a common confession. It can do so as well through diaconal care, by pooling together the resources of different congregations. And famously, it can do so through its government. In Acts chapter 6, when Hebrew-speaking churches and Greek-speaking churches have a problem, what do? They come together to solve the problem. In Acts chapter 17, when a church in Antioch can't decide the problem for itself, what do? Well, they come to Jerusalem, where other elders with the apostles try to solve, and in fact do solve, the problem. And did Christ give all the gifts that the church needs? Yes, he did. But he gave those gifts to the whole church, and the churches to work together. As well, the Presbyterians believe that any act of government that is relevant, not just for a local church, but for the broader church, ought to have the involvement of the broader church. When a minister is ordained, he is ordained to serve in a particular congregation, or perhaps to teach in a seminary. But his ministry is never contained to that church. When a local minister is on vacation or ill and they need someone to preach, what does he do? He serves in another church. He's not simply contained in one local church, but there's ways in which he serves other churches as well. They also believe this was true of discipline. Back then, if someone was disciplined, they didn't just say, oh, well, I'll just go to the church down the road. And they'll take me, no questions asked. No, back then, if someone was disciplined, the other churches in the area attempted to respect that discipline. And therefore, an act of discipline in one church impacted all the churches. And so they believed, whether rightly or wrongly, that a congregation could suspend a member from the Lord's table. But if they're actually going to be excommunicated, most Westminster divines believed that the presbytery needed to agree on something that dramatic. That's how seriously they took their connectionalism of the church. Now, of course, you can hear in all these questions that I'm raising that one of the issues has to do with the responsibility of presbyteries. How do local churches interact with one another and with regional presbyteries consisting of the ministers and elders of those churches? When Paul wrote to Timothy, he admonished him to remember the laying on of the hands of the presbyters. Now, for the Congregationalists, what did that mean? That meant the elders in the local church. But the Presbyterians understood that to mean Presbyterians of the elders of a greater body. And here again, the way in which the church cooperated in acts of government in Acts 6 and Acts chapter 15 become extremely important. The Congregationalists said not so fast. For example, Acts chapter 15, it said, that's an unusual assembly because the apostles are present. And if the apostles are present, then the assembly is not normal. You can't use that as a model. The Presbyterians noted 3 different features of Acts 15 that do suggest that this is how the church is to behave in a similar situation. First of all, we're told repeatedly that the apostles and elders did the debating and did the deciding. Not just the apostles by themselves. The apostles here are acting in concert with the rulers of the churches, doing normal work in the church. Second, when the decision of the council was finally made, it wasn't just sent back to Antioch, one local congregation, but it was circulated to all the churches of the area. Which means that this body was trying to serve all and was serving all the local churches. And third, as they framed their decision, it's interesting that the Council of Jerusalem said, or the Presbytery of Jerusalem said, it seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us to make these decisions. That's not the kind of language you make when you're just sort of gathering together for fellowship and making suggestions, which is another way in which the Congregationalists viewed the Acts 15 meeting. No, this is an authoritative body doing the work of Christ. The Congregationalists were still worried. They said if people can appeal to a presbytery, then someone who really deserves to be disciplined can just kind of delay their discipline forever. They can kind of work the system and stay in sin and not be helped. The Presbyterians were definitely concerned about that, but they responded that the possibility of no appeals to presbytery is fine if ministers and elders never make mistakes. But of course they do. And to have a system of government that pretends that ministers and elders always get it right is not right and isn't biblical. The Congregationalists eventually responded that they would rather appeal to Parliament if they had a problem they couldn't solve themselves than appeal to a presbytery. That's how vigorously they opposed presbyteries. Well, appealing to Parliament, that was the Assembly's next big battle. There was a long-running disagreement between members of Parliament, a slight majority of members of Parliament, and the vast majority of the members of the Assembly. What do you do about discipline? At the time that the Westminster Assembly met, everybody had to attend the Lord's Supper at least once a year. The government used the Lord's Supper to try and smoke out Anabaptists who didn't want to be part of the church, and Roman Catholics who didn't want to be part of the church. And if you did not attend the Lord's Supper, you would be fined, or worse. That's how the Lord's Supper was treated. The Westminster Divines realized that this was not quite what the Apostle Paul was teaching in 1 Corinthians 11. And they needed to change this. No, the Lord's Supper is for those who are professing believers, who are serving Christ and trusting in Him. Those who they didn't have the concept of membership in the church, but they knew that the only people who should be coming to the Lord's Supper were people who were professing believers. The House of Lords, by the way, tended always to be agreeable with the Assembly. The House of Commons said, well, how about this? How about we just exclude from the table people who are really sinful, scandalously sinful, and who are just unbelievably ignorant, who just don't know anything, or just don't know the basics. Well, the Westminster Assembly didn't really like that solution, but they thought they would try and work with it. And they said, okay, we will have ministers and elders determine who is seriously scandalous and who is ignorant. So ignorant that they can't be believers. So scandalous that they can't be followers of Christ. Parliament said, oh, no, that's not what we mean. We mean we're going to pass legislation that lists all the points of ignorance that might keep someone from the Lord's Supper, and every sin that might keep someone from the Lord's Supper. Well, the Westminster Assembly said, this is unbelievable. We can't do this. And in a period of 8 months, the Westminster Assembly sent 16 different petitions, 16 different papers arguing why this wasn't going to work. But what Parliament did was they said, look, if you're not going to list any points of sin or ignorance, then we're just going to make a law, and it won't have any points of ignorance or sin listed. And the Assembly thought, well, that's not going to be helpful. So they said, well, if people don't know that there's a triune God, then they shouldn't be coming to the Lord's table. So Parliament said, okay, we'll print it with just saying people need to know the triune God. Well, they say, well, not just that. They need to know that there's a Savior. Okay, we'll print it with triune God and Savior. And so in that way, Parliament sort of dragged out of them a bunch of points that you can see on your outline. I sometimes call it the Westminster Assembly's shorter confession. This little compact statement of what people need to believe, essentially, to come to the Lord's Supper. Interestingly, when it talks about baptism, it does not specify that they need to believe in infant baptism. The Westminster Assembly's standard for church members was different than that for church officers. Church members needed to be Christians to be part of the church. The officers needed to be reformed. And that's why you have different levels of specificity. Even though the members were called to rise to and be trained in the teaching that you find, say, in the Shorter Catechism. Well, Parliament and the Assembly went back and forth, especially on scandalous sins. And they finally dragged out of the Assembly, petition by petition, month by month, a list of scandalous sins. The Assembly protested. They said regarding ignorance, they said some people can give answers and yet have no more understanding of the things themselves than very children, who are as well able to repeat the words. And some do understand more than they're able readily in set words to express, of both which many instances may easily be given. There's people who can just say all the right things. There's people who struggle to say the right thing, but they do believe it. Which is why elders and ministers need to be given the opportunity to meet with these people and talk with them and understand them. You can't legislate the Lord's Supper like that. Likewise, the problem with the sort of set standard of holiness. The Assembly complained that, English people are way too creative in their sinning to ever come up with a definitive list. Well, the Commons ignored them and eventually said, here's the solution. If someone commits a sin that's not on the list, you just write to Parliament, and at the next meeting of a committee of Parliament, it'll discuss the sin, and then let you know whether it's something worthy of suspension from the Lord's Supper. The Assembly protested and said they simply would not cooperate. And at that point, Parliament began to threaten them, send lawyers to lecture them, and more. But that's a story for another day. Well, the Assembly protested what Parliament did with its ordinance or law regarding the Lord's Supper. But it was thankful, mostly, for what Parliament allowed with the Directory for Church Government. It was discouraged on one level. The Westminster Assembly argued from the Bible as to why Presbyterianism needed to be the model for government for the English Church. And then they gave a document that showed how Presbyterianism can be done. Parliament said, thank you. Put the first bit in the bin. We will not have any exegesis, any explanation from the Bible of why Presbyterianism is biblical. We're just going to make Presbyterianism the law of the land by our say-so. That was very disappointing. But for a little while, England did get to practice Presbyterianism because of the cooperation of both houses of Parliament. The one document that was the least messed with was the Directory for Ordination, which was one key part of, in fact, the earliest part of the Directory for Church Government. And I want to end tonight by reflecting on this very important document. The Westminster Assembly's Directory for Ordination had a few different parts. It began with a preface explaining that no man ought to take upon him the office of a minister of the gospel until he be lawfully called and ordained thereunto. People in those days were beginning to doubt this. If the Bible is as clear as it is, why would we need ministers to explain it? They began with this argument. And they said the work of ordination is to be performed with all due care and wisdom and gravity and solemnity. What's next? The first thing that they thought would be important would be a letter of testimony, a letter of recommendation. They required 6 different ingredients for their letters of recommendation. First, and oddly, they insisted that someone show proof they had taken the solemn legal covenant. This document signed between England and Scotland, saying that they would together fight against the king and reform their churches. This, of course, would limit the number of ministers in the church. There were good ministers who did not take the solemn legal covenant, and they could not proceed any further. This had the benefit of excluding people like Roman Catholics, who would not take the solemn legal covenant, and Anabaptists, who would not take the solemn legal covenant, but also excluded some good men. Next, the ministers or candidates for the ministry needed to show their diligence, the letter of recommendation needed to indicate that the candidate had been diligent and proficient in their study. They'd worked hard, and they were actually able to do the work. Third, they had to show proof that they had got a university degree. Lots of people went to university to graduate. They needed to show that they actually finished. Fourth, this is very interesting, they needed to show how much time they spent in university. Now that's kind of interesting, because there are people who just do university too quickly to actually learn anything. The fact that you can sort of barrel through all the classes and check all the right boxes doesn't mean you actually absorb what you need to learn. And on the other hand, there are people who take forever to go through university, and that's okay if you're doing it part-time. It's not okay if you're doing it full-time. If someone takes 8 years to do a 4-year degree, they're probably not going to be able to write sermons on time for a Sunday service. You know, it's not okay for the Sunday sermon to be ready by sort of Friday afterwards. You have to be able to do a certain amount of work in a certain amount of time. So interestingly, they cared about how long someone was at university. Fifth, they cared about how old the person was. This was a big debate. Could someone be ordained younger than 24? The law of the land currently said no. All kinds of Westminster divines had broken that rule. They had found bishops to ordain them when they were 21, 22, 23, and so on. But the Westminster Assembly decided that it was important that people be ordained at age 24, giving them some experience after university. What this usually meant is they would graduate around age 21 or 22 and have nothing to do. And what do you do when you have nothing to do? Well, the idea was you would go study with a minister. This is the earliest form of seminary. The idea that you finish Oxford or Cambridge, or Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, or I forget, St. Andrews, and you would go find a godly minister and help for a couple of years, be trained by him, be given additional reading. Well, the assembly, their sixth requirement for a great letter of recommendation was proof, a discussion of a person's life and conversation. Conversation doesn't mean speaking here, it means their manner of life. How did they conduct themselves? Were they godly people or not? And if people produce letters of recommendation and no one in the whole Westminster Assembly knew who that minister was, they'd say, go get another one. You need to find, there's enough of us here that if none of us have heard of this guy, he might not exist, or he might not be the kind of person that we really want to trust. So letters of recommendation can sometimes take a little while. If someone got the right letter and it was approved by the assembly, the next step approved by the assembly and then later approved by presbyteries, the next step for ordination was to be examined. And so there were 9 different rules for examination. First of all, and I think I have these on your sheet, that the party examined be dealt with all in a brotherly way, with mildness of spirit, and with special respect to the gravity, modesty, and quality of everyone. I love this opening rule. I hate to say it, but there have been times in the history of the Presbyterian Church when those examining a minister or a candidate have not been very mild, have not been very brotherly. They've been antagonistic or arrogant or played teacher to another minister pretending he's their pupil and so on. And not always is the attitude right. And this is the first place where the Westminster Assembly wanted presbyterians to check their hearts. How are they going to deal with this man? Were they going to deal with a brother in a brotherly way? Second, he shall be examined touching his skill in the original tongues. This is so basic, a knowledge of Hebrew and Greek. And his trial is to be made, this is how he's going to test him. He has to read Hebrew and Greek and translate it into Latin. I mean, isn't that the best way to know if someone does Hebrew and Greek? If he's defective in the languages, then there's a full investigation about how learned he is. If you haven't done your languages right, then they just stop and say, okay, let's start talking about your education here. This was considered to be so fundamental. And then they had to check if he was skilled in logic and philosophy and so on. The next question had to do with the authors of divinity, and he's best acquainted with. Who you read? Who are your theologians? Is it Joel Osteen? That's a problem. We're going to pause here. Is it Calvin, Bavinck? Is it Turretin? Is it Hodge? Well then, these are comforting. How well do you know these books? We're talking to people about what they read is important. They also wanted to know if someone was able to deal with the unsound or erroneous opinions, especially these of the present age. Can you deal with the problems that are going on today? The fourth, how could I possibly have forgotten this? They also needed to deal with the cases of conscience, the chronology or the order of Scripture, and ecclesiastical history. See, even then, they had Reformation-Day sermons with the 5 solas. They needed ecclesiastical history. And number 4, if he hasn't preached in public, he's to preach before the presbytery. Number 5, he is to give a discourse in Latin upon some commonplace or controversy in divinity, as shall be assigned to him. And he's supposed to have a dispute in Latin. I trust this is done in the Bible Presbyterian Church. We don't do the LPC anymore. We're all slackers. Here's a new thing. He shall preach before the people, the presbytery, or some of the ministers of the word appointed by them being present. This has never been done before. A man wants to serve a church. What does he have to do? He has to preach to them before he gets called. Episcopalians have never done this. They're saying, no, the congregation gets to hear. Can you talk about Jesus in complete sentences? This is important. And, just in case you can rattle people with nonsense, presbyters are to be there listening to that sermon. Number 7, the proportion of his gifts to the place he's called shall be considered. The Westminster Assembly on a couple occasions said, you can be a good pastor, but you're not a good pastor for a university town. All those educated people, someone else ought to go there. That's a hard conversation to have. But the truth is, not every pastor is good for every context. And by the way, it can also be true that someone's good for a university context that's not going to be great in another context. So, how do his gifts match? Beside the trial of his gifts, he shall undergo an examination in the premises for 2 days. What does that mean? He's to be given a 2-day examination in theology. Can he talk about all the main points of theology? And then, number 9, as for him who has formerly been ordained a minister and is to be removed to another church, is going to another church, he shall bring a testimonial of his previous ordination and of his abilities in conversation, and so on. What the Westminster Assembly was envisaging was something that had not happened before. And as you keep reading in the Directory for Ordination, you see what they had in mind. No longer would a man be appointed by a patron and assigned to a congregation after being ordained by a bishop in the bishop's palace. No, now a person would come before a congregation. He would preach to them. The Directory for Ordination goes on to say he should stay with them for a couple days so they can get to know him. And then, if they approve of him, he would be ordained in their presence. They would see him being set apart for the ministry. Someone would charge the congregation to encourage them to honor and be a blessing to this man. Someone would charge the minister to be faithful in his calling. No one had ever seen this before. This is just like a private thing that happened in the bishop's palace. And it's a wonderful vision. So this is one of the biggest changes of the Second Reformation in England, that people would choose their own pastors and be able to see him being set apart to work among them by the presbytery. Well, as I wind down and reflect on what we've talked about in the past couple of evenings, one of the things that's a bit of a surprise is that nowhere in all of these examinations is there a set theological standard that the ministers are to adhere to. And the 39 articles have fallen out of favor. The Westminster Confession had yet to be written. And so it's interesting that all these examinations go on with no doctrinal standard. Now, I'm not making a big deal of that. I'm not saying chuck the confessions in Presbyterian churches. I'm just saying that there's a confidence here that Presbyterians, through a careful process of examination, really can figure out who's Orthodox. And later they're helped by the confession. But it's a kind of interesting time in which people are being examined. Probably more significantly, as I reflect upon the kinds of things that Presbyterians cared about, the things that they're willing to fight about, be Christian soldiers to fight about. As I reflect upon ministers as ambassadors and physicians and shepherds, one of the things that comes through is the depth of earnestness and godliness, but also the depth of study that's required to be equipped for a lifetime of ministry. Not sort of 3 years and burning out, but year after year of hard work, of earnest study of God's Word, of dealing with a myriad of issues. One of the things that comes out is the importance, as we saw in these rules for examination, of being trained. And as I'm here as a guest of a Western Reformed Seminary, I couldn't help but think of how many churches I've been a part of that find it, not difficult to support their pastor. They see what he does from week to week. And so their budgets reflect the priority of supporting the pastoral work of their congregation. Likewise, after years of being a church member and pastor, I see so many churches that don't find it complicated to think about the Great Commission. And their budgets reflect that. They have money set aside for missions. Probably the persistent weakness in Reformed churches, but perhaps not yours. I actually don't know how your seminary works or is supported. And by the way, Tito did not slip me a $20 bill just before this last lecture. The thing that's easiest to permit is the support of seminaries. We lean on them. We want people to graduate from them. And yet it's hard practically to think about setting aside personal and churchly budgets to support them. And yet we do need them. Well, as well, it's easy to care about the world of our own day. We see the loss on the streets around us. We know about the millions who have not heard about Christ in our own world. It's hard to think about the next generation. And one of the things that seminaries are doing is preparing the pastors of your children and your grandchildren. And these are things less easy to see. And nonetheless, as I think about the priorities of the Westminster Assembly and the work of pastors as ambassadors and shepherds and physicians, I'm reminded of the importance of seminaries. Of course, it sounds entirely self-serving. I happen to be a seminary professor. But nonetheless, I want to encourage you tonight as you reflect upon these lectures to think about how God might be calling you to more earnestly pray for the work of seminaries and seminary professors that you know. And perhaps to earnestly support such work. Well, thank you again for the time that you've given me. We do have question time. I said I'd give more time tonight than last night. Last night we had 12 minutes, tonight we have 13. So that's the kind of generosity I had in mind as I